well, thank you very much for coming out today. My name is Andy Thayer. I'm with the Chicago Committee Against War and Racism. And we're going to be having a car caravan coming up in a few minutes. Some of our people who didn't feel comfortable being out here on the plaza. Now, ever since the dawn of the 24-hour news cycle and the explosion of social media, has there ever been an issue more thoroughly covered probably than the COVID-19 pandemic? And this coverage hasn't only been here about the United States, but it's been international. But one of the big things that probably the single biggest thing that's been missing in this coverage has been the devastating effect of U.S. sanctions and U.S. supported blockades of various countries. I'm talking about Yemen. I'm talking about Palestine. I'm talking about Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, and any number of other countries that you could add to the list. But this happens to be the 5th anniversary of the so-called Iran nuclear agreement, otherwise known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This was the deal that was cut between Iran, the United States, and the European Union that for a brief period of time meant that the sanctions against Iran were lifted. But now they're back in full force, and the Iranian people and other people who are suffering under these sanctions are suffering far more than probably anyone here in the United States. Because whenever you hear about governors or mayors complaining about the lack of PPE, think about if there was an entire blockade or if there were sanctions against said state or city. And that is what the people of Yemen are, for example, facing. That's what the people of Palestine are facing with United States support. Just to give an example in terms of the country of Iran, this according to a recent seminar held by the Atlantic Council. Quote, from the early 2000s all the way to 2001, 2012, there was a general period of economic growth in Iran. Income per capita went up quite a bit, living standards went up, and then after 2011 and 2012, with the first uptick in U.S.-led sanctions under the Obama administration, all the way to the present, with a more recent reinstallation and additional sanctions of the Trump administration, one can make the argument that Iran has experienced a kind of lost decade, the term that we use in development studies to describe Latin America in the 1980s. And as we've seen in this country, where black and brown people and poor people in general are on the biggest receiving end of the deprivation caused by the COVID-19 crisis. That is precisely what is happening in Iran and so many other countries. According to a professor quoted in this same seminar, quote, arguably purchasing power for Iranians has gone down by a third over the last decade. So these U.S.-supported blockade and sanctions are hurting the people of Iran, and yet here we are in the epicenter of the world COVID-19 pandemic, and we are oblivious, most people in this country, to the devastation being caused by our own government. So I'm going to call up a few speakers here who will speak to particular aspects of it. First, I'd like to invite Sean Reynolds, who is with Voices for Creative Nonviolence. Sean has had the honor of being on several solidarity delegations to the region, including a few times to the country of Iran, and can speak to personal experience about what he saw about the devastating effect of sanctions on that country. Let's give it up for Sean Reynolds.
Hello. We went to Iran. I've been to Iran once on a Code Pink delegation. By the way, the honking is our supporters. I have to speak over. But that's our car caravan. On our first day there in Iran, February of 2019, a year before COVID hit, we had a meeting, 90-minute talk with the foreign minister who coordinated, who negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, which is 5 years old today, with John Kerry. And as he told us, we needed to reach out to the West, and there are several issues dividing us in the West. But the nuclear issue seemed the easiest one to negotiate, since we don't have a nuclear weapons program and didn't at the time. And anyone who read the reports, international reports from the IAEA or other agencies, knows that there's no evidence Iran had a nuclear weapons program. What would happen is the IAEA would prepare a report saying Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program. A few days before it came out, someone would leak. The report says that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. The press would go crazy. This report that's about to come out says that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. The report would come out saying the opposite, and the press would be silent. And so the West fears that Iran has some of the technology of death that the U.S. stockpiles and constantly upgrades until now we have hypersonic missiles to enter our new two Cold Wars with Russia and China. And we can have our nuclear apocalypse on an even thinner hair trigger. But we met with him, and what seemed very salient to him, he was educated in the United States. He said he was diplomatic to his own government. Iran may have a lot of problems. We may have made a lot of mistakes. But you'll notice one country that doesn't have brutalizing sanctions placed on it is our neighbor and the country we fear most, Saudi Arabia, which is one of the U.S.'s closest client states in the world. And is everything we fear in Iran squared. Is hell on earth for women, is a dictatorship where if you even visit their embassy in another country, you might be murdered for the crime of U.S.-based journalism, as Jamal Khashoggi, a Washington Post reporter, was. And it's the leading world sponsor of terrorism. And yet the United States isn't brutally punishing the people of that country, and hasn't been for several decades now. And the question he asked is stop honking. Is the U.S.'s vendetta against Iran not about domination of the region, domination of oil sources, and just a habit the United States has of being obeyed by third world governments? Iran is one of the most defiant and one of the most patriotic and one of the most stubborn countries on earth. That's the reputation it announces to the world, and it's a reputation a lot of authors on the country and its history agree with. And they are a regional opponent of the United States domination of that country's oil, that region's oil resources. One thing he talked about negotiating with John Kerry was the war in Yemen. Our close ally Saudi Arabia is enforcing a naval blockade, not just sanctions, but a naval blockade on the country of Yemen, along with massive aerial bombardment. Meanwhile, Yemen has the worst famine in the world. It is the world's worst humanitarian disaster, with 24 million people requiring life-sustaining aid. That's 80% of the population. And so what we've done is continually help Saudi Arabia to continually bomb the country, to attack the port city of Hodeidah, where the aid has to travel through, surround the country with a naval blockade. We're actually building 4 of their near-coast combat ships up at a naval yard in Marinette, Wisconsin, before going back to building ships to fight wars in the South China Sea, like that's a good idea. But despite famine, despite modern cholera outbreaks, despite a terrible drought, we're bombing that country's infrastructure and stopping aid and supplies from coming through. And now, slowly, because it's not a very industrialized country relatively, slowly COVID is permeating the country. There aren't a lot of announced cases, but when you have no healthcare network, how are you going to identify the cases until the disease is everywhere? In Iran, we visited the Tehran Peace Museum, and it's a museum of chemical weapons activists. My group is Voices for Creative Nonviolence. Our precursor organization, Voices in the Wilderness, formed in 1996, when the sanctions the world were horrified by was the United States and the UN's sanctions on the government of Iraq. They'd been going on from 1991. They lasted until we invaded in 2003. They went between our two Gulf Wars. At the Tehran Peace Museum, the chemical weapons victims we met had been maimed for life by chemical weapons that Iraq was using, that we supplied Iraq with to use invading Iran back in the 1980s. So we met a man who's not going to spend 3 minutes without coughing for the rest of his life, and speaks with a rasp. One of the tour guides for the museum, an activist for this cause, has to constantly irrigate his eyes because of the vision damage being a soldier in the in the 80s in the Iran-Iraq War. When we had supplied chemical weapons to our servant Saddam Hussein, and we're helping him target the bombs. And he can't get the saline drops for his eyes. He waters them he makes himself cry with an onion. He can't get the saline drops because of the sanctions. I met a man in Isfahan in the public square there, big tourist city, and he walked up. He didn't say much. He said, "Well, obviously I'm the American. I'm the brown-haired fat guy." And it was obvious there were a bunch of us on the square that day. So he walks up and says, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from America. Sorry." And he shook my hand, and he sort of stared. It's a very polite country. I don't think he was very happy with me, but he was being polite. And then he shook my hands again and walked away. I figured, okay, that's the Iran-Iraq War and some of the nonsense we're doing now with the sanctions. So when we were talking to the foreign minister, he talked about 2 days they took off under a heavy deadline from the U.S. Congress. 2 days they took off to try to settle the Yemen issue, because one reason we're beating the hell out of Yemen and assisting COVID to swing aside through that country, along with cholera and hunger, is because they're allied with the Iranian government, and we want to stick it to Iran. And he talked about the deal that fell through them. I'm not going to go for Iraq. The United States is the wealthiest country on earth, and so we are callous enough from our experience of being that they want to send us to work so we can take COVID back from the workplace to our parents and grandparents, and the elderly can die already, and we can get back to business. Meanwhile, in Iran, the sanctions mean that their economy stops. They don't have the resources. They're one of the poorest countries on earth thanks to us, so they have to do the same thing. Iran just hit 200 COVID deaths a day last week. The virus hit them first of anywhere in the Middle East, because the sanctions meant they would die if they didn't deal with the only partner left who can trade with them, which is China. So it went straight from China to them. They've had it the longest in the Middle East, and they just hit 200 a day. That's a 9/11 every 2 months. It's time for us to allow the third world to emerge from the economic warfare punctuated by military warfare that the U.S. imposes. And that means we would have to get control of at least one of the two parties that run our government and tell them to stop destroying the third world for our profit. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Sean mentioned the country of Iraq, and for those who are not old enough to remember, the United States also had sanctions on Iraq, starting with President Bill Clinton many years ago. And when asked if the 500,000 deaths of children caused by those sanctions were worth it, then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said, "Yes, I think it was worth it." That, if nothing else, capsulizes the devastating effect of sanctions even before COVID-19 hit. Next up, I'd like to invite Bev Tang of the International League of People's Struggle, which is a Philippine solidarity organization.
My name is Bev Tang. I'm here with the International League of People's Struggle. The International League of People's Struggle vehemently condemns U.S. sanctions as a brutal tool of U.S. imperialism to slowly strangle its opposition, countries like Iran, into submission. It is a form of cruel and inhumane warfare The U.S. currently has sanctions which impact 1/3 of the entire world's population. That's 2 billion people who are hung out to dry in a slow and painful death because the U.S. has blocked their access to food and medicines and the resources needed for their countries to run their economy, to provide basic commodities and employment for their people. Just think of what happened here in Chicago. We know just a few weeks ago, we got a taste of this twisted practice when Mayor Lightfoot implemented curfews after the people's uprisings, which were sparked from the spate of brutal police murders of black people, including George Floyd. These curfews basically created blockades here in this city, cutting off the South Side, which is predominantly communities of black and brown, low-income people, cutting them off from accessing food and basic supplies. I got a call from one of our organization's members saying that the South Side communities lacked food and diapers, and even she needed medicine from the North Side. So if you can imagine, this is what the U.S. government can do against its own people. So imagine how much damage has been done after many, many years of sanctions on countries like Iran. And this equals thousands of deaths that could have been easily prevented. So now under COVID, it means far greater deaths because of the lack of personal protective equipment, ventilators, and medicines. We know U.S. sanctions target the countries who have stood up against imperialist domination, like Iran and Venezuela, countries who have fought their own national liberation movements to free themselves of colonial powers and advance their people's future towards more equitable systems of socialism. Just like the people in Cuba, the countries like North Korea, countries which the U.S. has geopolitical interest in so that it can gain valuable natural resources, like in the Middle East with Iraq, and countries who it contends with to be the top global superpower like China and Russia. The ILPS stands with the people of Iran and the people of the world, with the working class at the helm, to expose U.S. lies and bring down U.S. imperialism as the #1 terror in the world. It is the root cause of the people's suffering and destruction of this earth. We must expose sanctions as part of its imperialist neoliberal tactic to cling to power. We stand with the oppressed people of the world in the resistance and fight for national liberation and towards a socialist future. No to U.S. sanctions and U.S. wars of aggression. No to war on Iran. Hands off Palestine and Venezuela. U.S. imperialists are the #1 terrorists. Thank you.
Thank you, Bev. Next, I'd like to ask Lizzie Turner, an organizer with Chicago Area Peace Action, who's going to tell us about some important pending legislation.
Hi, everyone. I want to start us off with a chant. I know we're a little small, but I think we're mighty. No sanctions, no war. We won't take it anymore.
No sanctions, no war. We won't take it anymore.
No sanctions, no war. We won't take it anymore.
No sanctions, no war.
We won't take it anymore. Thank you.
Woo!
So I'm Lizzie from Chicago Area Peace Action, and I'm here today because too frequently I hear my peers talk about sanctions as if they are a harmless alternative to war, when in fact we know they are not. In Venezuela, there have been 40,000 deaths since sanctions were introduced by the Obama administration in 2015. Deaths caused by these sanctions. That ain't right.
That's right.
There are too many statistics like this around the world that everyone before me has shared of people suffering under sanctions. Sanctions are warfare and sanctions kill, especially during a pandemic. All this death and unnecessary suffering of innocent civilians, and academics give sanctions just a 20 to 30% success rate. That ain't right. So I have a specific call to action for all of you today. Representative Ilhan Omar introduced H.R. 5879, the Congressional Oversight of Sanctions Act, back in February. This is even more important now, given the pandemic, that we ensure that there is congressional oversight of sanctions. It limits the power of the president to impose sanctions and requires congressional approval and constant oversight. Given the expanse of sanctions currently, over 39 countries, a third of the world, I think we need a little more oversight, don't you?
Yes.
It will also increase protection for humanitarian aid, healthcare, and critical infrastructure. So I want everyone to get out their phones. I think some of you already do. You can go to chipeaceaction.org. That's CHI, peaceaction.org. And right there on the front page at the top, you can click Take Action. It'll take you to a letter that you can send to your representative asking them to co-sponsor this important bill. And again, that's HR 5879, the Congressional Oversight of Sanctions Act. And then later, after you send your letter, you can give them a call to remind them that you want them to sign this so that we can have long-standing sanctions reform to ensure that it does not get out of hand like this again. So thank you everyone for coming out today. I know we have all been isolated in this time, and it's so great to get together with everyone about this important issue. And I just encourage everyone to talk with each other and find other ways we can work together to help end these sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie. I'd like to welcome up Kobe Guillory, who is an organizer with the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression and a true leader of the local Black Lives Matter movement here in Chicago. And Kobe, as I know, is an internationalist and believes that black and brown lives matter not only here, but around the world. So let's give a warm welcome to Kobe.
Hello. So yeah, I'm a member of the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. We've organized so many protests, we've been at so many protests over the course of this uprising. And the question that we get a lot from reporters and, just white people who think that they're on our side is, well, what about the violent protesters? What about the violence at all these protests? And, that is in a country with millions of people in prisons, in a country with thousands of people every year being murdered by police. That is just such an absurd question to ask. And it's even more absurd when you think about what the U.S. does to people globally. When you think about the history of genocidal wars against other countries, about the history of economic warfare against other countries. And when we really get into that talk about violence, people have been trained to think about violence in terms of just guns or in terms of just people throwing fists at each other. But it's really much more, there's a much more structural aspect of the violence that we don't talk about enough. And we don't talk enough about the violence of depriving people of the resources that they need to stay alive. We don't talk enough about the violence that leads to children not having health care on the south and west sides of Chicago. We don't talk enough about the violence of there not being any grocery stores, but there's liquor stores everywhere. We don't talk about that. And when we look at these skyscrapers right here, there's people living here who are so rich and who have so much resources. And then a few miles away, there's people who are starving. There's people who are dying of COVID-19 because they don't have the resources, they don't have the means to keep themselves safe. And we have to fight against that because the U.S. and its allies and these rich people who create the conditions, who create these violent conditions of homelessness and of deprivation, of hunger, these people need to be fought against. Okay, there's no they're not just going to wake up one day and come to their senses and decide, it's pretty f***ed up that we've been starving people around the world. It's pretty f***ed up that people, that we've been closing down all these schools, because they're doing what they do on purpose. The fact that dozens of schools have closed down on the south and west sides of Chicago, that's not an accident. The fact that all these healthcare institutions, hospitals there was a hospital on the south side that closed down right at the start of this pandemic. Now that is a form of economic violence, that's a form of violence against the health and well-being of black people in this city. So we have to fight against that, because these politicians don't do shit unless we make them do it. We have to get together in our numbers, and we have to be organized to fight against them. So what the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression is fighting for is a civilian police accountability council that will give us the power to control the police budget and to control police policy, so that we can end the occupation, the police occupation in our communities, and so that we can defund the police on our own terms. Because the problem has been that we haven't been in control of our own communities, and that problem extends around the world, where people living in these third world countries are not in control of their own economic situation. So we have to fight for their self-determination, for their right to control their own destiny, as we fight for the right of black and brown people in this country to control their own communities. Yeah, I don't think I have much else to say other than America. I've been given 5 minutes. I feel like I haven't used all 5 of my minutes, but yeah, because CPAC now, free them all. We need to. There are people trapped in prisons and jails right now, and immigration detention centers, and those places are hotspots of COVID-19, because you cannot maintain social distance while you're confined and locked up with thousands of other people. So we need to fight to get them out, and we need to fight so that nobody is going into those places, because once again, the politicians are not going to do it. We're going to have to do it. So at the next anti-war protest, at the next anti-sanctions protest, I want to see everyone who's here, and I want to see y'all bring some friends, and I want to see your friends bring some friends, because this has to be a mass movement in order to get anything done. We are the ones who are going to make history. These politicians are not going to. We have to force them to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kobe. As many Black Lives Matters activists point out, some 40% of the city's operational budget goes to the police. But at the same time, many don't know that some 50% of the federal discretionary budget goes to the military. This is robbing our communities at home and abroad of the resources they need. So let's merge the movements. Let's stand up for black and brown lives everywhere, and not just here in the United States. Next, it's my pleasure to bring up 2 members of the Coalición en Solidaridad Latinoamericana. You can tell my Spanish is very, very poor. Carilia Drake Rivero and Manny of CESLA. Let's give them a warm welcome. We're going to have a discussion in Spanish as well as English. So come on up, please.
Hello, everybody. Gracias por estar aquí esta tarde para compartir algo que nos atañe a todos.
Thank you everyone for coming. In light of all the problems that are continuing on today that worry the whole world, Cuba also has problems that worry them as well, and that should worry every other nation in the world. This problem is the lack of universal peace, which is the same desire for all peoples and nations, and for that matter, it is also Cuba's desire as well. But that peace is not going to be given. It will be surely earned. Cuba is the biggest island in the Caribbean and has suffered for 60 years of brutal blockade, dealing with commercial, financial, and exterritorial sovereignty.
El brutal bloqueo comercial y financiero, además de ser extraterritorial. Un entramado de...
This is an unconventional war, not declared by the United States against Cuba, as well as the world, not just Cuba. And now, including the dear sister of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and it constitutes a collective chastisement and flagrant violation of human rights. We have to ask ourselves, why is this happening? Why are they blocking us? Why the sanctions? Why the boycotts against countries that are trying to progress for the benefit of their people? democratically elected people, democratically elected conscious nations that want to proceed as well. Why then negate scientists, Cuban scientists, against the fight with COVID-19, struggling and making the world a better place through solidarity? Why take their resources through imperialist action? Why are nations distraught from the right of the United States sovereignty? We desire sovereignty as well. The United States has given many reasons for this action. The nationalization of property owners in the island, the dangers of Cuba for the U.S. security and its relation with the Soviet Union, which is now extinct. These supposed violations of human rights on Cuba, let it be clear that there is also a violation of human rights through an embargo, which the definition is an order made by a country against another country in times of war through the retention of goods and the imposing of obligations against its legitimacy, like if it's a bond or a loan. This act of blockade is an act of war, and it is recognized as an international crime, including genocide, as the Convention of War Prevention and Sanctions in Geneva has put it in the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 9th of December 1948.
Internacional de genocidio, según la Convención para la Prevención y la Sanción del Delito de Genocidio, aprobada por la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas el 9 de diciembre de 1948.
Cuba never owed the U.S. anything, and it has not committed the supposed violations that the U.S. nation has done against other countries, and it doesn't represent a danger to its national security. Neither does Venezuela, which Obama has declared as a threat extraordinary against the United States. The U.S. blockade goes against the principles of human rights made in that 1948 assembly. One of those principles is the equality principle and the principle of no intervention, principle of independence and rights of nationalization, which is what the U.S. is violating during these years. During the consecutive 26 years, almost as a unanimous action, the United Nations has and its allies have expressed an extreme criticism against the blockade of Cuba. And of course, the United States, having all the military power, has vetoed this unanimous vote and now plans to use this vote in the UN Assembly to block any criticism against Israel during their colonization of Palestine. The blockades are illegal and they're an act of war, if you haven't seen this yet, since 1948, and it has been applied unilaterally against countries of quote-unquote lesser than the United States in the name of peace. Recently, during these times of pandemic due to COVID-19, the Cuban government has tried to buy ventilators vital for the lung capacities of those infected from Swedish companies, IMT, Medial AG, and Acutronic. But in April of last year, these entities were already bought by American company Vyaire Medical Incorporated, and they had to suspend commercial relations with Cuba, thus its restrictions from the blockade. The U.S. government has maintained a persecution of the island and its people. They pretend to have some sort of justice through war, hunger, and brutal force.
Pretenden lograr su rendición a la fuerza, por el hambre.
Although we are still blockaded in this criminal act, the revolution must go on and be with full force. One of the highlights of this revolution is the progress in the health sector. And I'm not going to even mention this point because everybody knows that Cuba is in solidarity with everyone during this pandemic. Nevertheless, the American government has not even made the sanctions and blockades against Cuba flexible, nor for the people of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The health professionals in Cuba and the Revolutionary Guards have been taught with the principles of a socialist society. Health is first. We care more about life and another human being than all of the riches in the world. The Cuban doctors, we are not slaves. We are not exploited. We are not spies. We are not traitors. We are socialists, humanitarians, and internationalists. Our human conviction of internationalism is the heritage of the best and brightest daughters and sons of Cuba. Céspedes Maceo Martí, Máximo Gómez, Mariana Grajeales Mella, José Antonio Chivaria, Vilma Espín, Camilo, El Che, Fidel, Raúl, who will never be shot. We will continue to be loyal with their legacy and we will not waver. Let's turn back on the solidarity role and the human brigades of the Cuban doctors, Henry Reeve, and we will surmount to the initiative that they be elected for the Nobel Peace Prize. We implore you to support the candidature of the contingent medical professional Henry Reeve to the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts against COVID-19, something that Cuba has advanced and fought with their developed industry of biotechnicals, with the sending of 41 brigades, medical brigades, up to 34 countries and their territories. Please sign the petition at cubanobel.org. Thank you.
cubanobel.org. Thank you.
Since my friend here was mentioning all of the solidarity that Cuba and Latin America, Venezuela have for everyone here, I love to see everybody, all these organizations in solidarity with Iran and now and Palestine as well. What I have in my hand is a huipala. It's an emblem of the Andean nation, Andean peoples, Andean communities. It's a call for rebellion against imperialism, neoliberalism, and genocide of indigenous peoples around the world. This dates back before the Inca Empire. We are here in solidarity with everyone. Our black brothers and sisters from all over the world in their fights due to the diaspora. We're here with our Filipino brothers and sisters as well, and with our comrades in Iran. It's really difficult to see what is happening in the world during this pandemic, where the state has amassed enormous power. But with gatherings like these, doesn't matter how many people show up. What matters is who will be there when the time is right, when it's time to call forth. Because that time is coming soon. The U.S. empire is crumbling. Right now in my country of Bolivia, there is, right now as we speak, a protest, mass protest nationwide against neoliberalism and imperialism due to United States regime change in 2019, where more than 36 indigenous lives were killed in the name of progress and U.S. democracy. I was here in that very cold night in October when all of this was going on. And I said, here, I'm going to say it again, like I did before, we will prevail. We've done it in 2003, we've done it in 2005, and we will stand aside our Palestinian brothers and everyone else against imperialism, U.S. imperialism. So, I'm going to teach you guys a word, and I want you guys to say it back to me. Halyaya means energy, bringing the energy, opening up the frequencies of good, positive vibes from the netherworld to above, Hayaya. Okay? One big one for me. Hayaya, Bolivia. Okay, that was the test one. Hayaya, Iran. Hayaya, pueblos afroamericanos. That's right. I like that. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Corelia and Manny. Our second last speaker is going to be Patrick McWilliams from the Answer Coalition. Let's give a warm welcome to Patrick.
Hi, my name is Patrick McWilliams. I am, as Andy said, with the Answer Coalition. I'm also a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation here in Chicago. And we are proud to be standing out here in solidarity with so many others demanding an end to the U.S.'s sanction regime around the world, which has already caused so much untold devastation to so many different peoples. We'd also like to thank the organizers for convening this very important Speak Out here on the anniversary of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal, and everyone out here today who managed to take time to come together to commemorate this. Because I think, as everyone knows, we are in a moment of crisis right now, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that we find ourselves at the nexus of many intersecting crises. Of course, there is the pandemic that is still ravaging this country, setting new records for cases every single day. Millions have been thrown out of work. Rents are coming back. Moratoriums are ending. Increased unemployment benefits are ending. And there's no relief on the horizon from this government at all, despite an unprecedented wave of evictions that are coming down the pipeline as we enter an economic depression not seen in this country since the 1930s. And at the same time that all this is happening, we're also seeing that not just the U.S., but the entire world is rising in justified rage against white supremacy and this racist system and all of its manifestations. From fighting back directly against the racist terror of police occupations and murder, to tearing down racist symbols and statues, to questioning the economic oppression and exploitation of this entire capitalist system, which so many are saying is, of course, directly intertwined with racism institutionally since its birth. But I'd like to say that we are out here today not in spite of these crises, but because of them. Because these are not separate issues from anything that we are talking about here today. Just like the U.S. is not separate from the rest of the world, and we are not separate from what the U.S. does to people around the world. The generals in the Pentagon, the president in the White House, the millionaires who are senators out there, they haven't forgotten about Iran. They haven't forgotten about Venezuela, about Cuba and Yemen, and all the places that they continue to oppress with their economic regime. That is, instead of taking a step back, instead of looking in the mirror for a few seconds and seeing what is going on here, right here at home, our leaders continue to sanction countries around the world. And as if in this moment the U.S. could somehow claim any kind of moral authority when our streets are on fire justifiably, and when again millions are waiting in long lines just to get a bag of groceries. So instead of taking care of people right here, the rulers of this country are using this moment to further their agenda for domination and hegemony around the world, to make it safer for corporations and capital to flow, and damn whatever happens to the people. The people of the world should be coming together in this time. We should be fighting the common enemies that we have. COVID-19, climate change, the scourge of white supremacy and racism. But instead of coming together, here we are dividing the people on nationality, on class, and so much more. And why are they doing this? Why increase these attacks instead of working together in a time like this? I'll tell you why. It's because they want us to think that Iran is our enemy. They want us to think that the countries around the world, those are our enemies. Those are who we have to worry about. Let me tell you, Iran didn't cause thousands of evictions in this country. Venezuela did not make our healthcare system completely inadequate to deal with this crisis. North Korea didn't cause cops to be racist in the U.S. Yemen didn't make mayors and governors keep open their economies in blatant disregard of medical evidence. Palestine did not throw millions out of work and make unemployment benefits impossible to get for so many workers, especially those without papers. And Cuba did not tell Chauvin to kneel on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. That was done by people right here in this country, in the U.S. So I'd like to ask, who is our real enemy here? Who is the real enemy of the people? Because I don't think our enemies are thousands of miles away across oceans with military budgets a tiny fraction of that of the U.S. or of, in many cases, even of the Chicago Police Department. I think our enemies are right here at home. Our enemies are those who would rather fund more bombs, tanks and guns, more tear gas and batons than keep schools open in our city, who can't even provide clean water to our citizens from Flint to here in Chicago, yet will make billions in profits from our labor and then point to Iran or Russia or China and say that's who you've really got to be worried about. That's who we're protecting you from. I don't think so. I reject that. We know who our enemies are. Again, they are the people right here at home, and they don't want us to realize that because we outnumber them. They know if we unite, if the people of the world unite, we can solve our problems, we can take the power, and there is nothing that they could do to stop us. Now, I'd like to make one other point, as well as many other speakers have touched on, a very important point. Is that you hear sometimes people say sanctions are an alternative to war. Sanctions, not war, is sometimes even a slogan that some people raise, as they did during the lead up to the invasion, the criminal invasion of Iraq in the early 2000s. But we need to be very clear about something. Sanctions are war. Sanctions deny people access to food, to medicine, to clean water, to essential infrastructure. As we say here, sanctions kill. It's already been mentioned, of course, but during the 1990s, the criminal sanctions against Iraq, which were a precursor to the U.S.'s invasion of that country, killed 500,000 Iraqi children. And of course, as was said, Madeleine Albright, when asked directly on national television, that's Clinton's, a Democrat's, Secretary of State, famously, of course, said that those sanctions were worth it. I don't think they were worth it to the people of Iraq. I don't think they were worth it to those murdered children. Maybe they were worth it to the banks and to the Pentagon, but not to the people. And sanctions, of course, as we've seen, are often a precursor to war, to direct war, to regime change. Back in the 70s, of course, in Chile, when Salvador Allende was instituting progressive reforms there to benefit the people, Nixon, of course, famously said that they needed to make the economy scream. And that is exactly what they try to do today via this regime of economic terror instituted by sanctions to try and make the people suffer so that the leaders who are not loyal to the U.S. can be overthrown. Just this year, Trump threatened Iraq with more sanctions for trying to move U.S. troops from their own country. So we see that there's a direct line between these sanctions and between the wars of aggression that the U.S. has been constantly engaging in and continues to engage in to this day. So we just need to realize who is warmongering, who is making this world a more dangerous, less peaceful place, who has invaded sovereign nations and overthrown their leaders over the past 20 years. Who has Iran invaded? Where has Venezuela sent troops or established military bases around the world? The answer is nowhere, but of course the U.S. continues to do this, continues to be the biggest threat. And that is why we say that the biggest threat to the world today is Donald Trump and the USA. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Our final speaker is going to be Josh Aguilar of Anak Bayan, Chicago. Again, an important organization in the Filipino solidarity movement and struggle for an independent Philippines.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I'm Josh from Anak Bayan, U.S., part of the National Democratic Movement for Genuine Democracy in the Philippines. And we are here to denounce the atrocities of U.S. imperialism that has cost the lives of our Iranian, Cuban, Korean, Yemeni, Bolivian, countless Venezuelan, brothers, sisters, and siblings. The U.S. sanctions on Iran particularly are part of their continued wars of aggression, threatening countries from around the world to withhold goods in exchange from the 82 million working-class Iranian people who are now dying from poverty, hunger, high unemployment, and lack of resources, now worsening under this global pandemic. This threat to Iranian sovereignty is part of a history of U.S. imperialism there. From the killing of democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh, installing U.S. puppet Shah Pahlavi, and most recently murdering Major General Qasem Soleimani. The Trump regime, the U.S. government and media have and will continue to find ways to demonize the Iranian people, to justify the warmongering, to justify occupation. The U.S. will continue to deceive and send our working class youth to fight these wars. This must end now. In demanding an end to these sanctions, we side with the people of Iran and assert their rights to their land and to their freedom. In demanding an end to these sanctions, we will not bow to the wishes and opinions of U.S. allies like Israel, and opinions of those like Saudi Arabia, who threaten genocide on Yemen and continue to do so. U.S. puppets like Duterte, who buy $2.5 billion in U.S. arms and pass an anti-terror law to imprison people like me, people like us who speak out. In demanding an end to these sanctions, we want the money and resources to go back to the people here, to ending the global pandemic, to ending white supremacy. We must continue to educate, organize, and mobilize more people here. Like my friend said, like what Kobe said, we need to bring our friends. We need to bring friends of those friends here. It is through people here and the masses uprising abroad that will win justice everywhere, and also particularly for our Iranian siblings. And so lastly, I just want to say to, speaking of Duterte also, we are going to be fighting against and protesting his State of the Nation address on the 27th of this month at 6 p.m. at the consulate just a couple blocks down. We hope you can make it. I'm glad to see you all here. We need to continue showing out for each other. All power to the people.
So in addition to the event that Josh just mentioned on the 27th, I'd also like to call your attention to Hiroshima Day, which is on August 6th. There's going to be an event down at the statue in Hyde Park that evening. And also go to Chicago, shypeaceaction.org to support that bill that was mentioned by Lizzie Turner of Chicago Peace Action. Thank you so much for coming out today. We're going to attempt to get this broadcast in somewhat edited form on Chicago Access Network TV so that our voices will carry forward from here. Thank you so much.